happened to Bioshock? When most people think of how they define film, for example, things like Citizen Kane, Pulp Fiction, Ben-Hur all come to mind. These are the titular examples of what film can be. With television, it's things like The Wire and Breaking Bad. There are very few properties that define a single medium. Properties like those are once in a generation if those mediums are lucky. It requires near perfection and near ubiquitous appeal to reach those heights. Bioshock is one of those properties when it comes to gaming. It is one of the most recognizable IPs to ever be placed in the hands of gamers, and it is also one of the most eclectic, incredible, and disappointing franchises that gaming has ever had. It also completely disappeared. It's a series about religion, about capitalism, about art, a series that would make any existential teenager a very happy individual. Bioshock is next to impossible to truly define. So it's not what we're going to do today. Instead, we're going to be taking a look at the trajectory of the series, at the realities that are often spoken on forums and blogs. Is Bioshock really a one-hit wonder, the result of one finely crafted game, or a series consistently defined by the praise often heaped in the first game's direction? Why did the series disappear after Infinite? What happened to Infinite? Today is for answering each and every one of those questions. What the happened to Bioshock? As I went back to update my back catalog, I started to think more and more about Bioshock and just how much minutia and detail there is out there about this game, how it was made, this trilogy, and what exactly happened to Bioshock Infinite. So today I want to go through and I want to kind of talk about this series in a roadmap fashion, from the very inception of it to how weird that was, to Bioshock 2 and its multiplayer realities, to everything that Bioshock Infinite was supposed to be and never became. Bioshock is one of the best series to ever grace any game platform, and yet a lot of people are unfamiliar with exactly why these games became what they became. So today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about just how great this franchise is, and most importantly, examine whether or not that quality actually carried all the way through, or whether there was a hard stop on it at some point in the trilogy. So to get started, I guess we have to take a look at the very, very beginning of all of this. Bioshock was essentially a game that was in the making for almost a decade. Irrational Games was founded by Ken Levine in 1997. He did this by poaching a lot of talent from a studio known at that time as Looking Glass, the studio that created System Shock, and with that team, they put together their first game, a game that would fail and be the beginning of what we know as Bioshock. That game was System Shock 2, a sci-fi cerebral shooter that critics loved due to its tight controls, amazing story, and importantly, incredible atmosphere. This was a combination that every single reviewer, blogger, outlet enjoyed. Gamers, on the other hand, were a bit less interested, and Irrational Games' first release quickly became a financial failure. Ken Levine would bring the idea for System Shock 3, a sequel to that game, to EA and other publishers, but they were uninterested. If no one bought the second one, why would they buy the third? So the team shifted focus, creating and releasing games like Freedom Force, while canceling others mid-development like Deep Cover, and even finishing and then never releasing a game called The Lost due to copyright and legal complications. But Levine never gave up on the System Shock idea. In the early part of the 2000s, they developed a concept. The concept was fairly simple, and it revolved around gameplay. There's some sort of robot carrying a resource, an entity that acts as a bodyguard for that carrier, and antagonists that look to retrieve that resource. A three-tiered gameplay loop. By the end of 2002, this idea had been turned into a demo, in which a person known as Carlos is tasked with heading to a space station to rescue someone from a cult, then has to deal with monsters and the aforementioned gameplay realities. If that sounds familiar, keep Bioshock Infinite in mind. We'll get back to it. This prototype was built for the original Xbox, and the story was meant to be political in nature. Unfortunately, the team hit a familiar problem. They could not find a publisher, but instead of abandoning the idea, they completely revamped it. It quickly became a game that took place in a World War II German laboratory, before finally being revamped again and landing on a reality after Ken Levine saw a statue of Atlas in Rockefeller Center during a trip to New York. That idea would finally become the Bioshock we know today. So what exactly is that Bioshock?
Brought down some salt in case you change your mind about the popcorn.
I can leave if this is making you uncomfortable, Mr. Bubbles.
Oh, please. Mr. Bubbles was my dad's name. Call me Bub.
No need to beat around the bush. The original Bioshock is a gaming masterpiece for many of the reasons you don't particularly think about before a game releases. The three-tiered gameplay loop developed in 2002 turned into an ecosystem involving little sisters, big daddies, and harvesters, and the game itself featured pretty cool powers and reasonably interesting and enjoyable gunplay, but that's not what made Bioshock memorable. Instead, it was everything that was built around it. Bioshock is a masterclass of atmosphere design being melded so tightly together with story and gameplay that the three create a level of immersion rarely seen within the medium. You're dropped into the most beautiful, interesting hell you could possibly imagine. Throughout the course of an entire game, you never rise to the top of the food chain. You are always vulnerable. You're always staring into the eyes of something far more menacing than you. And that extends beyond your own player vulnerability. The Little Sisters are a stroke of absolute genius by Ken Levine and his team. The Little Sisters create a moral dilemma that goes beyond your typical, will you, won't you save this individual? Instead, Bioshock paints a literal picture of innocence in the Little Sisters and asks a very simple question. After killing their protectors, the people they see as fathers, will you harvest their lives for your gain or rid them of their pain instead? It's a dilemma that asks you if being vulnerable, if being challenged in the short term is scarier than stealing innocence. No one forgets that first decision. When you combine all of this with a story that pulls from real history, psychology, and even sociology, what you have is an experience that demands far more from you than most games could ever dream. And while its final boss may be a bit too much and out of place, the way Andrew Ryan's story plays out is some of the best storytelling this medium has to offer. Now, the second game, a great game in its own right, did a bit less on the story front and shifted the vulnerability away from the player, but most importantly, was not developed by Ken Levine's team. But that game could be its own essay. Instead, today is for looking where the series made its biggest shift. It's time to look at exactly what happened to one of gaming's most polarizing releases, Bioshock Infinite.
Chore now, was it? Ah! Why is this in my hand? Who throws a syringe at a person?
Remember the original idea for Bioshock that saw a man named Carlos heading to a space station to rescue someone from a religious cult? Well, that was an idea that Ken Levine never forgot about. It stayed in the back of his mind. It's an idea that eventually did turn into its very own game. Except instead of a space station, we got Columbia. Bioshock Infinite's development is one of the strangest stories of last generation. It was an absolute mess. Irrational originally tossed around the idea of returning to Rapture, but literally became bored with the idea early in development, and thus the decision was made to move on from Rapture. And eventually, they landed on Columbia, the city in the sky, a roving world's fair, a game about segregation, about religion, about politics, about race. The first problem the game hit was the studio itself. 2K had placed a lot of Levine's staff at Marin to create Bioshock 2, including John Che, who Levine had considered so integral to the studio and its productions that he was the yin to his yang of that organization, where Che would handle production matters while Levine worked on the creative side, allowing him to do exactly what he wanted to do, create the actual game. Thus, Ken Levine struggled to create a new staff, to build a new studio to replace everyone that had left him. And during the same time, the company was in the midst of a schism as to where to head next as a publisher and even as a studio. And this created a problem within Irrational. The larger expectations of Infinite required Levine to manage a team of 150 developers, as reported on a multitude of occasions, and he was just not able to do so. He was not able to know them personally, to figure out how they worked, to best put this team together to be the most productive team possible. And this created a much less collaborative development environment. But there was an even bigger problem that stemmed from this very reality, and that was an ambition problem. When you create what many view to be a masterpiece in Bioshock 1, your mind meets one reality. How exactly do you top something viewed as nearly perfect? The version of Bioshock Infinite that was originally revealed in 2010, a game that was said to be just a year away from release at that time, was unrealistically ambitious. A game that was beyond graphically impressive, that included gameplay elements and traversal elements that were so technically difficult to pull off, powers that were so impossible looking to make usable, that almost everyone that saw it wondered how they were going to pull this off. This version of Bioshock Infinite was much more open, much more responsive, and also impossible to create in the context of that studio. And it's not the Bioshock Infinite that gamers eventually would get their hands on. Instead, Bioshock Infinite would be something drastically less intense and far less boundary pushing, but it was something that was immensely interesting nonetheless. The final version of Bioshock Infinite is at once great, and also the very reason why there will never be another Ken Levine Bioshock game. So what did Bioshock Infinite end up being? Well, that depends on who you ask. If you ask me, for example, you'd hear about how Bioshock Infinite is criminally underrated and is right up there with the original release. But if you ask many others, you'll hear about how Infinite doesn't even deserve the Bioshock name and simply shouldn't exist. Many of the problems levied towards Infinite are big issues, and they're hard to disagree with because they're semi-objective. The first is that much of the freedom and choice presented to players in the original game had evaporated across the board. Instead of being quite open in the way players choose to explore the world like they did in Rapture, Infinite was quite linear in the way it moved the player through Columbia, and was extremely linear when it came to player choice, of which there was relatively none. A solid bit of irony given that Rapture was a fallen series of tunnels and Columbia was a wide open-aired space. The second and arguably biggest problem is both a subjective and objective issue simultaneously, and that is the story and the way the story is told. There are lots of moments in Infinite that do a great job of representing the dichotomy between freedom and hope and the desperation of having that stripped from you. The organ rendition of Girls Just Wanna Have Fun that plays on the beach as Elizabeth dances once free from her tower, quickly giving way to the anarchy of freedom, is one of those moments, but the story itself is not everyone's cup of tea. Arguably too much of it is told through collectibles in the shape of voxophones, and what is there presents to players a twisting tale that just does enough to have something to say without actually saying something real, or at least that's how many interpret it. But it also creates a character of nothing in terms of gameplay value in Elizabeth, and presents an ending that is not only nuanced, but also a little too out of the blue for a lot of players. A happy ending, it is not. When you combine this with gameplay sections like the Songbird battleship fight that come off as trite and annoying, as well as an underutilized and underdeveloped skyhook system, what you have was a game that has had holes poked in it in the years after its release. Even Ken Levine didn't enjoy the game's development either, and has insinuated that the final product is not the one he was hoping for. He stated that the game's development soured him on the big studio life, aged him drastically, and turned game making into a chore he couldn't control. This would be the game that would cause Levine to allow for the closure of Irrational and would see him walk away from Bioshock altogether. But surprisingly, this may not be the end for the series. It seems Bioshock has a future after all, with or without Ken Levine. That is where Project Parkside comes into play. Project Parkside, one of the most unassuming codenames you could possibly give to an in-development project. What exactly is Project Parkside? Well, that is one of the most interesting questions in gaming. 2K has a litany of studios under their belt. One of those studios is Hangar 13. They're the studio that created Mafia 3, a game that underperformed greatly for 2K. But there is apparently a top secret studio operating right next to Hangar 13 that is creating a project that has an air of secrecy around it that is more than rare. That studio is being kept small, according to those with knowledge of the situation, and a studio that is in the early stages of development on a new project. That new project is codenamed Project Parkside. Project Parkside is a new entry in the Bioshock franchise, a franchise that will likely go the entirety of a generation without a single release. This is very interesting for a multitude of reasons. The first and most important is that this project will be missing the key component that helped shape everything that Bioshock was. That would be Ken Levine. Ken Levine let Irrational Games dissolve just 4 short years ago and moved on from Bioshock to head up a new studio called Ghost Story Games. What this means for Bioshock is anybody's guess, but it's never a great thing when the heart and soul of a franchise is removed from its creative realities. The second thing to keep in mind when it comes to a possible 4th entry in the franchise is that in the span of just a single generation, gaming has shifted drastically as a medium. The amount of single-player only, non-microtransaction riddled games coming from companies like Take-Two and publishers like 2K are almost non-existent. They're the same publisher that stated last year they don't anticipate releasing any game in the future that does not feature reoccurring consumer spending opportunities, or, in layman's terms, microtransactions. What this means for a franchise that simply shouldn't have any of these realities will be something that gamers will have to find out for themselves in a few years, but regardless, it is something to keep in mind as this game quietly continues its development cycle. It is really easy to imagine Mass Effect without EA. It's really easy to imagine The Matrix without the Wachowskis. It's next to impossible, however, to imagine a completely reinvented Bioshock without Ken Levine. Bioshock 1, its sequel, and Infinite are games that every single person that is passionate about this medium owes it to themselves to get their hands on, to play it at the very least one time. Because each and every one of those games has something interesting to say, has a message to send, and most importantly, shows off what gaming can be. If 2K is going to bring Bioshock back, it would behoove them to be extremely careful with this particular property. There's not a single other property outside of the JRPG genre that is held quite as near and dear to gamers' hearts. Gamers will not accept anything less than the originality and quality of the original 3 games. A trio of games that carve their own path and refuse to pander to its audience, regardless of the casual consumers it may alienate in the process. A series published by one of gaming's most money-hungry publishers, but yet managed to avoid almost all of the realities that normally come with games published in this bubble. If any series deserves to hit players' hands one more time, it's Bioshock. But this cannot be a cash-in. This cannot be a half-assed attempt to capitalize on a hot name like Mass Effect Andromeda. A new Bioshock, whether it's in 2018, 2019, or 2020, must be treated with respect. No series deserves it more.
Well, guys, that was it for today's doc, and it's always sort of a dialogue. Right now, I want to know what you guys think about Bioshock in general, but what I'm most interested in, I guess, is 2 things. One, how do you feel about Infinite? Do you feel like this is a game that lived up to the hype, that was amazing, that you loved, or was it lacking, disappointing, or just not your cup of tea? And number 2, I kind of want to know where you guys feel or how you guys land, or I am mixing up a lot of sentences right now. How you guys feel about the trilogy as a whole. What is your favorite game in that trilogy? Why is it your favorite game? What is your least favorite? I really want to know where these games land in your head in terms of, even if it's just 1, 2, 3, in terms of ranking them. That's something I'm really curious about because I obviously don't have a lot of conversations about Bioshock anymore, given its dormancy. So I'm really curious about that from your guys' perspective. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. If you're not yet a member of this team, press subscribe. I put out gaming analysis and examinations twice, sometimes 3 times a week, so hit subscribe so you do not miss any of those. As always, if you enjoyed this video, I just said that, but more importantly, if you enjoyed the video, my Twitter handle is in the top pinned comment down below. You can find me there to get an idea of what games I'm playing, find out what I'm talking about, find out what movies I'm watching, and just overall be a part of the channel in a more, I guess, hands-on kind of way. As always, my shout out for the day is Fearsome Fire, a guy I have personally met and hung out with. He's a great dude. He is a streamer. He's not really a YouTuber so much, but he's an amazing streamer. Mostly streams Mario Odyssey. I know that might not be your cup of tea on this channel, but if you're looking for a streamer to check out and for Nintendo stuff, Fearsome Fire is your guy. So definitely check him out. And until next time, guys, I'm out.